It was a cold, tense evening when I finally had enough. "Stop joking around," I shouted, throwing the box containing the black dress into the trash. Anger and frustration boiled within me. This wasn't the light blue dress my daughter Karen had asked her father for. Instead, it was something dark, heavy, and completely inappropriate for her school ceremony. Just then, I heard footsteps. Susan, my mother-in-law, entered the room and saw what I'd done. "Mary, what on earth are you doing? Throwing away a gift from Joe? That's from your husband to his child. Don't you think she'd be upset?" She glared at me, genuinely surprised by my reaction. My frustration couldn't be contained any longer, and I knew I couldn't let this go. I pulled out the note that had come with the dress and thrust it into her hand. "Can you still defend him after seeing this?" I asked, my voice trembling with rage. I watched as her face turned pale. "My name is Mary, a 38-year-old office worker, and I've been married to Joe for nearly 10 years now. We met in what seemed like fate, a random gathering at a mutual friend's party. As the evening drew on, I sat alone, lighting a cigarette, feeling like the only smoker in a crowd of health-conscious friends. Then, Joe appeared, cigarette in hand, and grinned as if he'd found a comrade. We bonded over our shared love for rock music, which had been a big part of my life back in college when I used to frequent live venues. Smoking and music were my comfort zones back then, and Joe shared those passions. As the night progressed, it was as if we were in our own world, laughing and sharing stories about our favorite bands. When he asked for my number, I knew we'd be seeing each other again. We started dating, and it felt like I had finally met someone who truly understood me. Our relationship felt like a whirlwind, and we quickly became inseparable. After 2 years of dating, Joe proposed to me in the most heartwarming way. I still remember the look in his eyes as he got down on one knee and said, "Mary, marry me. I want to be with you forever." It was the most genuine moment of my life, and without a moment's hesitation, I said yes. We planned a simple but beautiful wedding, surrounded by close friends and family. I was confident that our shared love and interests would carry us through life together, filling every day with laughter and companionship. But marriage, I soon realized, wasn't just about the two of us. With Joe came his family, and with his family came certain expectations, especially from his mother, Susan. My first family gathering with his parents was awkward, to say the least. Susan was polite but distant, her eyes scanning me as if evaluating every part of me. I felt judged and slightly uneasy, but I put on my best smile for Joe. Over time, I tried my best to get along with Susan, though it wasn't easy. She was protective of Joe, always questioning my choices, especially around the holidays when we'd visit for family dinners. "Mary, do you make nutritious meals for Joe? He looks thin these days," she would say, her eyes narrowing in judgment. I'd reassure her that I did indeed cook balanced meals, but nothing I said ever seemed enough. "You should focus on nutrition, Mary," she'd insist, almost like a warning. I started feeling like she'd never accept me, no matter how hard I tried. But despite my growing frustration with her, my love for Joe kept me grounded. Whenever I looked at him, I saw the same man I'd fallen in love with. He was caring, funny, and supportive, and that was all that mattered to me. Even though Susan's behavior often made me question my place in the family, Joe always reassured me that we were a team. 3 years into our marriage, I found out I was pregnant. Joe was ecstatic, wrapping me in a hug and telling me how excited he was to become a father. We shared the news with our families, and despite our differences, Susan was thrilled to hear about her grandchild. As the months went by, the pregnancy started taking a toll on me. I was constantly tired and felt sick almost every day. With Joe working long hours, it became difficult to manage everything on my own. When I shared my struggles with him, hoping for a bit of relief, he suggested something that left me stunned. "Why don't we ask Mom to come over and help?" he said, almost too eagerly. The idea of Susan living with us made me uncomfortable, but Joe seemed certain it was the right solution. Reluctantly, I agreed, hoping that perhaps Susan would be less critical if she saw the effort I put into our home every day. To my surprise, Susan's attitude changed during my pregnancy. She took on household chores without complaint, often cooking meals that helped ease my nausea. She even prepared dishes with light flavors and nutrients, saying, "When I was pregnant, I couldn't eat much either, so I made these kinds of meals." For the first time, Zrenia, I felt like she was genuinely trying to support me. Susan visited regularly, helping with chores and preparing dishes that even I could manage to eat despite my discomfort. Her presence was unexpectedly calming, and I began to see her in a new light. Perhaps I'd misjudged her all along, assuming she'd always be overbearing and harsh. By the time Karen was born, Susan had become an important part of our daily routine, helping me through the early days of motherhood. I started to believe that maybe Susan had cared for me in her own way from the beginning, even if it was hidden under her critical gaze. Karen brought a new joy into our lives, and for a while, everything felt perfect. I was thrilled to see Joe as a father, even though his work hours kept him away more than I liked. Susan's help was invaluable, and she seemed to love Karen with a fierceness that softened her usual demeanor. But as the years went by, Joe started coming home later and later. He'd excuse himself, saying he was meeting friends or dealing with last-minute work issues. Karen, who was initially close to her dad, began to notice his absence. She'd ask about him constantly, her small face filled with disappointment every time he failed to show up. I brought it up to Joe, hoping he'd make more time for her, but he brushed it off, saying he was too tired from work. It hurt me to see Karen disappointed. I felt like I was shouldering all the responsibility at home, and Joe's distance only made it harder. Tensions continued to rise, especially as Karen reached school age. One evening, she came to me, her eyes shining with excitement. "Mom, can I wear a new dress for my school entrance ceremony?" she asked. I agreed, thinking it would be a nice opportunity for Joe to be involved, and he promised he'd get it for her. "Don't worry, sweetheart, I'll get you the best dress," he said, giving her a rare smile that melted my heart. Karen eagerly told him she wanted a light blue dress, and for a brief moment, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe Joe would finally step up and show he cared about his family. But as the days passed, I noticed that Joe hadn't done anything about the dress. The ceremony was just a week away, and he continued to go out, leaving me wondering if he'd forgotten his promise. Finally, a package arrived with Joe's name on it, and Karen squealed in delight. We opened it together, but the dress inside was nothing like what she'd asked for. Instead of the light blue dress she'd dreamed of, it was black, a deep, ominous color that seemed more suited for a funeral than a celebration. My heart sank as I saw Karen's disappointed face. But what truly disturbed me was the note attached to the dress. It read, "A gift from Joe and me to Karen. It's worth $1,000, so use it carefully. Maybe for your funeral, for example." I was horrified. The message was cold, cruel, and completely out of line. Who would send such a thing to a little girl? My anger reached a boiling point, and that's when I threw the box into the trash, feeling a surge of betrayal that I couldn't ignore. Just then, Susan appeared, looking shocked as she saw what I'd done. Her disapproval was evident, and she scolded me for discarding the gift. But I couldn't let her ignorance continue. I handed her the note, my hands shaking with rage. "Can you still defend him after seeing this?" I demanded, watching as she read the words. Susan's face went pale, and for the first time I saw real fear in her eyes. "Does this mean Joe's having an affair?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The weight of her words hit me like a ton of bricks. An affair? The possibility had crossed my mind in fleeting moments, but I had never seriously considered it until now. The thought that Joe could betray not only me but our daughter made my stomach turn. After a few moments of shock, Susan collected herself and took my hand. "We need to find out the truth," she said, her voice steadier than I expected. I nodded, feeling a strange alliance forming between us. That evening, Susan and I planned to confront Joe. We needed answers, and I was no longer willing to ignore the signs. When Joe arrived home, Susan greeted him warmly, offering his favorite dessert as if everything was normal. He seemed relaxed, oblivious to what was coming. As he sat down to enjoy his cake, Susan accidentally spilled coffee on him, forcing him to go change. As he left the room, I seized the opportunity and grabbed his phone, quickly scanning through his messages. My heart pounded as I found what I had dreaded: texts from another woman named Sarah, filled with endearments and plans for their next meeting. It felt like a punch to the gut. Determined to make him face the consequences, I sent a message to Sarah from Joe's phone, pretending to be him. "Come over. I want to introduce you to my mom," I typed, my hands shaking with anger. Her response was immediate. "Finally." I'm so happy. Minutes later, there was a knock at the door, and I felt my heart race as I opened it. Sarah stood there, her face lit with excitement, completely unaware of the storm she was about to walk into. I led her into the living room, where Joe, now changed, looked up and froze in horror. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" he stammered, his face draining of color. Sarah looked at him in confusion, then at me, starting to realize she'd been set up. The silence that followed was thick, each second stretching painfully as Joe struggled to find words. Before Joe could stammer an excuse, Susan stepped forward, her voice filled with contempt. "How could you do this, Joe? How could you betray your wife and daughter like this?" Her words were harsh, but I could see that she was just as devastated as I was. Joe stammered, trying to explain himself, but the guilt was clear on his face. Sarah, seeing that the charade was over, tried to defend herself. "Joe told me he was going to leave her," she snapped, looking at him with accusation. Joe's face contorted with regret, but he didn't argue. He simply stood there, silent, as the truth of his actions sank in. Susan, once his strongest defender, looked at him with disgust. She turned to me and said, "Mary, you don't deserve this. Whatever you need, I'll be here to support you."